Welcome everyone to our webinar for today for Supply Chain Council. We're continuing our series on the Management for Supply Chain Overview, M4SC. And today we're going to be covering the process piece. These webinars are all being recorded. They're being posted also on YouTube for your easy access. The volunteers who are working on the development of this project are going to choose one team to work on. So these are being recorded so that everybody can go back and listen to these in the future and make their decisions about which group they want to work on. Also, please type all of your questions during the course of the webinar in your question box, which you can see on your screen. And any easy questions I'll answer right away. Additional questions we'll answer at the end of the webinar. So please do type those in so that we have them ready. Today presenting will be Casper Hunche, who's Research Director for Supply Chain Council. And I think I will turn this over to you, Casper. Do I have any other announcements prior?
Not from me.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Melinda. Welcome, everybody. So this is the third installment of the M4SC overview. Today, we're going to look at the process layer. Joe Francis did the strategy layer 2 weeks ago. Last week, I talked about the network layer. And so today, we're getting into the process layer. So we're going quickly through this one more time, just for people that haven't seen this yet. If you consider at the top left that there's a business strategy that we try to meet with our supply chain, then you understand that there are specific requirements coming from a business strategy into our supply chain. And if we meet those requirements, then we can say that our supply chain is functioning optimally. So the first step in this M4SC framework basically looks at how do I translate business requirements, business strategy into supply chain strategy. And really when you look into the content of these activities, what you'll see is that it's very focused on identifying what are the supply chains that I have or need to put in place to meet the business strategy. What are the metrics that I would measure for these supply chains, and then identifying what are realistic goals in order to meet the business strategy so that I can determine where I have any gaps in performance. And that process describes basically managing the strategy of a supply chain. Last week, we talked about the network. So managing the network. So you can imagine that if there is a specific business strategy that drives a supply chain strategy, that you need to identify how you best meet this supply chain strategy. There are many different ways to get a product from your suppliers to the customer. The question is, how many supply chains do I have? That's a strategy question. And then once you've identified that, then you can say, okay, what does the supply chain look like? That is basically what we do in the supply chain managed network in M4SC. So trying to identify, is my supply chain optimized? Does it have the right routes? Do I have the right high-level processes in place? Should I be make to stock because customers want it immediately, no turnaround time? Or do I want to offer some level of customization? Or do I need to feed my orders up to the supply chain so that I can meet the unique customer requirements? Once you've identified the optimized network or how you want to change the processes, then obviously you can look at managing the process. And that's really what we're going to look at today. So managing the process is basically the set of activities that says, are my processes performing at the right level so that my network is working optimally, which means that I'm meeting my supply chain strategy, which then means that I meet my business strategy goals. So today we'll dive into much more detail about what managing the supply chain processes represents. The final step is then to look at the supply chain resources. And that layer basically looks at, do I have the right resources in place to meet my process goals that hopefully are now aligned to my supply chain strategy, my supply chain network, and of course my business strategy. So that will be discussed in 2 weeks' time in the M4SC resources webinar. But today our focus is going to be on the supply chain process management layer. So question, of course, apart from the wrong title on this slide, are what are the problems that the process layer addresses? What are some of its major components? What are drivers for these activities to take place? And I wanted to spend some time on the next steps around the framework itself. And this is when we start talking about volunteering and research projects. So what are common problems in the supply chain process layer? Well, of course, one thing that we hear from companies a lot is that they have process management capabilities, but they are distributed unevenly through the organization, through the company. We have a high level of confidence or competence at one place, and in other places we're kind of doing it ad hoc. We're not having a really structured approach, etc. So we often see that large corporations especially have a very mixed bag of process management capabilities. So companies experience that as a key problem. The other problem that we see is that there's generally a problem that companies or management believe that there's a one-size-fits-all for processes, the network, the strategy, etc. And using M4SC helps companies rethink what is the level of differentiation that I need within the processes themselves. So trying to find the right balance between standardization and being responsive to specific needs from markets, etc. Of course, one other thing that the network layer, or the process management layer focuses on is things like, how do I even make sure that certain tasks are performed? Do we do this activity, and how do we measure that? So if we're talking about the M4SC process layer, then there's about 12 unique activities that we've identified so far that are performed by companies that have been participating in our early research about how you manage process. The first one here is basically trying to get an understanding of my current state processes. So this looks at how is material flowing, what are the key processes that I have in place, etc. But now we're at the detailed level. So if you remember, we talked about similar topics at the high level in the network layer, where we said differentiate where I'm performing certain high-level activities like make to stock versus make to order. Here now we're diving into the detail of how work is performed. In network, we look at what is the work that is performed. In process layer, we look at how the work is performed. And second, we look at the data around that work. SCOR metrics obviously start at a very high level. At this point, you're looking much more at performance of individual processes. How long does it take to perform certain tasks? What's the cost of a certain activity? Those kind of things. So the question here that we're trying to identify is, how do you measure performance of a certain process, and how well, what's the score that we have for that? The third step, the process value stream model, basically tries to identify where the non-value add activities exist in your process flow. This is something that we see in other methodologies as well. It's a powerful tool that helps basically identify what tasks are redundant or unnecessary in the overall process flow. At the fourth, we look at who is responsible for doing what. A key activity, obviously, in understanding what today the roles and responsibilities are within the supply chain, who's responsible for the detailed tasks within that process. This obviously plays with things like organizational responsibilities, problems along the lines of, once I've completed my task, I hand it over to somebody else and then it goes into limbo land, all those kind of things associated with roles and responsibilities. The fifth activity within the process layer is looking at the practices. What we see is that companies often talk about process standardization, and practices really is one of the key elements of standardization of process, because often it's not the detailed transactional stuff that they want to standardize on, but the capability, and that's really what the practices represents. So doing a practices analysis helps you basically understand how am I doing compared to what we believe is the right way of doing business. Then the last task within the analysis is basically looking at the process efficiency. So this looks at activities that are waiting for time to pass. So often what we see is that to make a process faster, for example, you don't need to actually work harder. It simply means that you need to remove a barrier, like a clock, a time element that has to pass. We only schedule orders once a day. If I schedule them twice a day, I don't have to do faster scheduling. It's merely increasing the frequency, for example. So these are things that you can look into as part of the process efficiency analysis. Where do I have yield problems? Where can I increase speed, etc., of the process? Once you've identified kind of where the problems reside, then you can obviously start thinking about how do I resolve the problems. And in step 7, we basically talk about what's the idea that you want to pursue. How do you think you're going to resolve the problem? So this is much more around developing a scenario of how you think the process could be improved than to document the detail of how that exactly is going to work, which is really what step 8 is. So once you've identified kind of one or more scenarios that you would like to pursue, then in step 8 you're going to work those out into detail. This is where you're basically going to document your to-be process. What's the activities? Who does it? What's the automation we use for that? What are the parameters that the systems need to know? All these kind of questions need to be answered as part of the step 8. Step 7 really talks much more about the concept that you're trying to put in place, that you evaluate and select or reject. In step 9 then we look at verifying basically those scenarios that we've worked out in step 8. So process design is an activity obviously that can have a large impact on your organization. Even a small change in process can have a large impact. And so for changes that you anticipate to have a large impact, you probably want to test whether it's going to actually give you the outcome that you are looking for. And that's really what we talk about in step 9, where we're talking about process simulation. This is not necessarily highly complex software. Process simulation can be anything from a simple walkthrough with a couple of very knowledgeable people, all the way up to high-tech simulation tools, which generally means that you have to feed them a lot of data and parameters before you can even see the results of that simulation. Companies generally say that depending on the expected effort of putting the changes in place, they're willing to put more or less effort in the testing as well. So those are all activities that are trying to get a picture of what the future processes could look like. This, of course, has also impact on things like business rules and organization, and that's really what the next two steps are focused on. So business rule redesign really talks about what are the changes that people need to know once you put the new process in place with regards to decision-making criteria. Things like, how often do I do something? Can I, as part of the new process, can I give a refund? Or, you know, what's the rules around how we accept returns? What's the lead time on certain products going forward? All of these kind of you know, parts of process information need to be clearly defined. And then, of course, on the organizational aspect, you understand that if you make changes to process, you potentially impact the roles and responsibilities of individuals and groups within the organization. If you think back in the earlier parts, we talked about the RACI chart or RACI analysis of the existing process. Well, this is really talking about the RACI of the future or go forward process. Then on the last is basically looking at the outcomes. So what are the priorities, the urgencies, if you will, of these changes? So potentially a process management activity can develop a large amount of changes. Some of them are going to be large, others are going to be small. So this really looks into what are the changes that I want to put in first, which are the dependencies, etc. So all of these leads to a set of changes that you want to put into place. And that's really what the process management layer tries to put in place. So the question, of course, is what drives this set of activities? Well, we know that there are obviously changes that may come from the other process layers, or the other layers. So, for example, a change in business strategy or an adaptation of a business strategy in a supply chain strategy, a change in the network obviously may require me to make changes in process. So I know that the strategy and the network layer may drive changes in process. We also know that, of course, if you have the resources processes activities not being able to support our process requirements, that there may be a feedback loop. That's the bottom arrow coming in to this layer that says, you know, the resources layer may say, the things that you want from the resources, we can't support that. We can't support that within the parameters, within the boundaries that you have set. And in the middle, then you see the events. So obviously, there are other things than just management activities that may drive you to look at the processes. As an example, if you have repeated customer complaints, you may say, well, this is a good time to look at this set of our processes because we're experiencing a high level of customer dissatisfaction, which means that we're not meeting one of our strategic goals. The other influences obviously may be things like problems with suppliers or disappearance of suppliers. There may be changes in your competitors, etc., etc. So those may also be things that drive trigger activity in the process layer. So the question, of course, is why do companies use the M4SC process layer? Obviously, it is a validation of their current management processes. So it helps them identify where are some of the potential improvements of how we manage a supply chain. It helps them define who's responsible for specific management activities, and it allows them to also talk about how you standardize these type of management processes across the company, multiple supply chains or business groups. And of course, it also allows you to internally assess what the maturity of your process management capability is within the company. So if you have a group that virtually does none of these activities using a structured approach, then you're generally talking much more in a adhocracy versus when you have a formal set of processes that you measure and optimize over time. That allows you to really look at the maturity of your process management capability. So one of the things that I did want to ask some feedback from the audience, whether it is today as part of the commentary that you can give online or later through email. You'll find our email addresses at the end of this slide deck. Is the question, what are the kind of things that you have, kind of questions that you have around this? So last time when we did the network management layer, there were a lot of questions like, how does this relate to X? Or can we do this activity as part of step 12? Well, those are exactly what we refer to as research projects. And somebody sent me an email after the last network presentation saying, when you talk about research projects, what do you mean? Is that somebody sitting behind their desk and going on the internet? The answer is no. Research projects for us is basically volunteers like yourself who spend time discussing about what are tools, techniques, usability, problems, etc., with the kind of activities that we've discussed. Are we missing stuff? And that's generally a question around how does this fit in, etc. Or are there better ways to discuss certain or to address certain problems? So those are all what we would refer to as research topics that we're very interested as part of the volunteering activity to have people look into. So today, we have a first pass of this M4SC framework. It's a set of activities that we have seen repeated over multiple companies that manage supply chains at a fairly high level of maturity. And our question really is, what is it that we're missing? So some of the things that we did get feedback on is things like, how do I sell this to my boss? So I got that. But how does this relate to our automation tools? Or what's the impact of risk on process level management? In my industry, this is a very standard way of performing these kind of analysis on roles and responsibilities, or the cost structure of my supply chain. So these are all good questions, and I would like everybody on the call to think about, if you see kind of these 12 steps, what are the things that you would see fit in there that you think that may be missing? What are the things that you say, I think that's the same thing as a previous step? Or what are the type of topics that you would really get more understanding about? And that's really what we want to get to with M4SC. If you think back in SCOR, or if you look at the history of SCOR, 16 years ago we had SCOR 1, which was a starting point of a journey that's lasted now for 11 revisions, and every time we got more content into it because people looked at it and said, it works for me, but. And so this is the same question that we're trying to ask here, which is, this would work for you, but what are the things that you would be interested in learning more about? So just a quick pause here. Melinda, are there any questions at this point about the process layer?
No, I don't. I think that when you said all of those things, that's kind of covering what people have questions about. So okay. I don't have any any real additional questions at this point.
Okay. Well, let me then take some time to go through kind of the balance of the webinar, which basically talks about what's the next steps from what we can see. So first of all, for those not familiar with Supply Chain Council, we're a non-for-profit that performs research in the area of supply chain management. We have a tool called SCOR. If you haven't looked at that so far, go to our website, supplychain.org, and learn more about it. Especially in the resources section, you'll find a lot of presentations about what SCOR is, and also examples of how companies have used SCOR. Our research is driven by volunteers, so it's the companies, the practitioners, the people that work with it, the people that work in supply chain with their experience globally that participate in the further development of our intellectual property. And the one thing that we provided for our members then is the ability to learn and to work on these projects, to meet others, etc., and of course through training to further their knowledge about our frameworks and our other topics. And we do a lot of that also through the regional events that we organize. So M4SC further development, volunteer driven. So our key question to you is, what is it that we need to do as a next step? Well, we've kind of laid out a webinar schedule to give people, first of all, of course, an introduction into what M4SC represents. We started in July doing kind of a high-level overview, went through strategy, network, today process layer, and then 22nd of August we'll talk about the resource management layer. And next week we'll have a repeat of the introduction from the 18th. Then moving on from that, we're starting to move into the volunteer planning activity, and you'll see a couple of events in the future. We do have 2 more trainings scheduled at this time, one for the M4SC network and one for the M4SC process. And we do have some limited seats for people that want to volunteer. So please contact Melinda or myself if you're interested in becoming an active volunteer. Then we're working towards our activities in December, where we'll have a off-site activity in Palm Springs, where we're basically going to review kind of the outcomes of the individual project teams that we're going to establish within in the coming months. So it's kind of a first pass of what are the findings to first results of the research teams as they have been put in place in basically August onwards. So that's kind of our schedule. So what's the what are we looking for from a volunteer perspective? So we would like to understand from volunteers, obviously, what it is that we need to do for our next revision, fine-tuning, etc. So we need volunteers to sign up. We'll ask you to participate in one of the teams. These webinars are intended to give you the kind of high-level understanding of what each area represents, so that you can make a first selection to see where you and your skills best fit. Because obviously people that are operating in the strategy layer may not feel very comfortable necessarily in focusing on reviewing the resources layer, and vice versa. So sign up, participate in our hosted event in Palm Springs if you can, and help us drive change in supply chain management. Supply Chain Council really wants to focus on supply chain management. Historically, we've focused much more on the project kind of focus. These activities really are intended to give companies the tool set to structurally manage a supply chain rather than just throw a couple of projects against it to fix it. So that's our call to action. So last slide then talks about the context. So myself, Research Director at Supply Chain Council, and Melinda Spring, also on the call, who works with the volunteers. So please contact us if you have any more questions on volunteering, etc., or even the M4SC framework. And Melinda, I give it back to you.
Okay. I do have a couple of questions just around these things like the training, etc. So I know I've got a very global group online, and so I'm getting questions about, other ways to attend the training besides being on site. So I don't know, maybe you want to address that question.
Yeah, at this time, we don't have plans laid out in detail of doing this in other regions of the world. These trainings that we're talking about here are purely kind of to position the volunteers. We need to look into if there's another way to address this. I think this is an excellent question.
Right. So we'll let them know if there's another. I think so far what we've been talking to the volunteers about is that people who are able to attend in person then can share that knowledge with other people on the teams is really all I've had so far.
Yeah.
So I have another question, similar question about the international volunteers on how does a volunteer not in the U.S. actively participate. And we will definitely have the teleconferences and the webinars for each team will definitely be scheduled to accommodate global volunteers. We need to have global volunteers because this is a global project, and it's very important that we have representation from all parts of the world and all industries and cultures. So that's a very important piece of this that I will definitely accommodate in the setting up of the meetings. Let me see here. And same question about the Palm Springs. Is that mandatory to be a volunteer? Because, we have so many people from the global community, and that's definitely not going to be something that's mandatory.
No.
It's obviously very helpful if you can meet in person, but it's not something that's required.
Correct.
Let me see here. Oh, and there's a question about selecting volunteers and if SCOR P certification is required. I think that I do have to say that membership in the council is required because you won't be able to access the information. That's only the information is only going to be available on the members' site. Casper, do you want to address this further?
Yeah, I think supply chain management experience is probably more important than SCOR P certification. I think SCOR P certification is tremendously helpful because a lot of the activities that we currently have identified are obviously built upon SCOR. So people that are familiar with SCOR have a large advantage over those that are not. That doesn't necessarily say that they couldn't bring in, a good angle or good information. So SCOR P certification, I wouldn't say is a requirement for participating as a volunteer. However, we do for training require people for the M4SC training for people to have at least gone through SCOR framework training, if not being SCOR P certified, because otherwise it's really a tough job for the instructor to keep those that are unfamiliar with SCOR focused on the M4SC content. That's our experience.
Yeah. So you don't need to be SCORP certified to work on the volunteer teams. However, if you're going to go to the training, you do.
Correct.
I'm getting kind of repeats of the same question. So again, someone's asking about if the training will be available via web conference, and we don't have that ability at this point in time. But I know that you're looking at those kinds of things, Casper, for the future. Okay, this one says maybe it's possible to distribute any materials about standardized view on supply chain processes so that everyone has a common view. The same for resources, which is the next webinar.
So if the question is, do we distribute the content of M4SC prior to the webinar?
No, I think the question is not that. The question is more just so that everybody is starting from the same place and has the same understanding of what a supply chain process is or what the supply chain processes are, that there is information distributed just on basic supply chain process in advance.
Yeah, see, this is a perfect example why we're saying that when you go to the SCOR, to the M4SC training, that you need to have that SCOR fundamental knowledge, because whenever we're talking in the M4SC processes, network, and even the strategy layer, you will hear us talk about standard SCOR components, the processes as how Supply Chain Council practitioners have identified as the processes within supply chain.
So then basically it's the SCOR processes. So
right.
So they can anyone who is not familiar with the basic SCOR processes, actually the basic information is available publicly on the website. So, but again, you should be a member company in order to access the member only information on SCOR.
Correct. And M4SC, yes.
And M4SC. Let's see, I think I've got one more here. How does the IP and confidentiality of information for a company, how is it protected?
So any of our research teams, all the information that you submit on behalf of your company, you have to obviously have clearance that you can share that information. We do not really expect or even want companies or representatives from companies to share confidential information that we would not be able to get either through publicly known information or other common access. So generally what you'll see is that there's a requirement, and even when you register on our website, that's one statement that you subscribe to that says that whatever you share, you are clear to share to a larger group outside of your own company.
Okay. And here's a question. Somebody that's been working on a CSCP certification course. How much time is he still allowed to volunteer? Which I would say yes, of course. But how much time? And I get this question a lot. How much time does this require of a volunteer? And really, the time is how much time you devote to a volunteer project is really entirely up to the volunteer. But we'll have set teleconferences that you would be expected to participate in most of those. Obviously, we all can't be on every meeting all the time. But We will have teleconferences where the volunteers will be expected to participate, likely every 2 weeks. Towards the end of the project, we may do something more like every week, but it'll be likely a biweekly teleconference. And for each of those teleconferences, obviously there would be some work to prepare. But how much time you put into this is really, you're a volunteer, so we can't tell the volunteers how much time or how much work to put into things. So every bit of information that you can contribute is helpful.
Yeah, I think that the project teams will reverse that question at you and say, we will take any amount of time that you can share. How much is it?
That's right. Getting a lot of questions here. Just a minute. I'd like to volunteer, but despite I am certified SCOR P, I am not a council member, as I run a sole proprietorship and work as a consultant. Is there any chance that I can participate? I think we'll talk to that person on an individual basis. So if you can email me, mspring@supply-chain.org, and see what we can do with your membership, or how it. Okay, I'm getting a lot of repeats of the same things, so I think that I'll answer these, or we can answer these on an individual basis. Casper.
Okay.
Wait, hold on. For people that do have the SCOR training and understanding, will you complement this with distribution of the currently available M4SC material?
If we don't share the material, how can you review it?
That's right. So the answer is yes. So that was an easy one.
Yep.
Will the results of each project team be cross-distributed amongst the other teams?
Yes. Well, yeah, we actually have one item on that agenda that specifically talks about how do the different teams relate, and then obviously also at the event in Palm Springs is really where we're having all the different teams present out what the outcome was so far.
Yeah. Okay, I think we answered everything for the most part. Those of you who I didn't quite answer your questions, like specifically the really small membership question, we'll take that separately. But I think that we have answered everything else. So I think that completes our webinar for today. Anything else to add, Casper?
No.
Okay, thank you everyone for attending. Good day to you all, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. And we hope to have you on the next webinar in a couple of weeks on resources. The dates and registration are posted, and I'll also send all of you individual invitations to these. So thank you very much. That concludes for today. Good day.